ये जयेश YouTube में ऐसे क्या दिख रहा है ये कि 2 people are waiting करके?
Hello.
Jayesh, you can hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I'm saying वो YouTube पे ऐसे क्या दिख रहा है कि 2 people are waiting करके?
That is because they had scheduled a reminder for it, and that's why they are able to see. Just a minute.
Hey, why am I echoing?
I'll tell you.
I can hear you. Oh shit, my voice is echoing, Jayesh.
Yeah.
ओ जयेश अपना अभी ये पूरा कॉन्वर्सेशन वो YouTube लाइव पे भी आ रहा है.
To bet, Arun, he will know the answer to the question.
The name starts from S. You have 5 seconds, Philip. You can't get it. S. Stuart Pierce. I have another question, but that's for the end. I'm going to reserve my next question. It's easier for the end. We'll start the panel discussion right away. Before handing over to panel to Parul for the moderation, and I'll of course come back once in a while to pose some softer questions for the panelists. Philip, Dinesh bhai, Porus, Akhilesh sir, in that order. Philip, starting with you. Your first reactions on this G7 tax deal, the announcements. Do you think there is too much euphoria? Or do you think the tough part now awaits the rest of the world? What do you make of this tax deal? Your initial reaction, 60 seconds.
Okay. I wasn't surprised. There is such pressure to reach an agreement that this was very much anticipated. The hard negotiations in some senses are yet to come because there's a number of steps that have to be gone through. So it didn't particularly surprise me. And the terms, 20% of the profit in excess of 10% in Pillar 1, very much in line with what was expected. 15%, since the Americans have dropped from 21%, 15% was expected. So no huge surprises there.
Fine. Dinesh bhai, what do you make about it for India? What's in it for India?
Well, I'll answer differently. Your question was, what does this mean overall, Arun?
Yeah.
And my immediate reaction is that we are looking at a new tax regime and therefore a new era of tax litigation going forward. It's going to bring its own complexities. It's going to take several years before we reach a consensus, many more years before things settle down, and a lot more litigation. A great time for international tax practitioners.
Thanks. Porus, your take, Porus? Porus, you're on mute. Sorry.
Well, I think it's a landmark deal, and what surprised me is the speed that it's come, and I think that's primarily due to the new American administration. So I think in a period of 6 months, we've got to a position where we were just struggling for at least 2 to 2.5 years. I agree with Philip that there's a lot of hard work, and some of the crucial steps will be the G20, what the US Senate does with this. These are some of the crucial things that we'd have to look out for.
Yeah, from America first, it's now, again, one world, one tax, maybe some could say, with the Biden administration coming in. Akhilesh, pleasure to always hear from you. If you were in the CBDT still, what would be your stand, Akhilesh?
No, but it's a significant development. There's no doubt about it. 7 of the world's largest economies are coming to some sort of an agreement. Now, of course, it's a broad agreement in a very broad shape. There are a lot of details which are to be worked out. I have worked closely with the OECD people who are working on the details, and I can tell you there are many other points of where there can be some disagreements or scope for arguments. But the fact that 6 months ago we were thinking that there will be no solution at all for this matter, and now we are in a position to say that, look, 7 large economies have said yes, we agree on the basic contours, and it means there will be some sort of an agreement coming up in times to come. So it's good. It's welcomed even by the government of India, I think. And let's see what very eager to know what happens later on. What happens now as to how the G20 take it, and what sort of agreement is reached on the finer details of the proposal.
Parul, over to you.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Arun. Thanks a lot, Taxsutra, for putting together such an eminent, panel, panelists together. Absolute honor to be here and, talking to all of you. Not to waste, further time, but directly to start getting, into further questions. We've already set the tone. Arun has said it, very fantastically. We've all heard that the G7 agreement, it is reiterating the hope for a global consensus and at the back of a US support, which had been missing for quite some time. Is this really a historic achievement, or is the excitement which is being generated, is this really premature? What are the hurdles that still need to be crossed to bring this agreement to reality? While the G7 is comprised of the large, developed 7 countries of the world, but the G20 still has powerful economies like China, India, Brazil. And of course, there are 150 plus countries that still need to agree to such an agreement, whether it's the Pillar 1 agreement or the Pillar 2. So I think I'll start off with, Philip. Philip, very quick question to you. The G20 is supposed to meet in July, just next month. How do you really think the discussions could possibly take place? I mean, do you have a crystal ball, where you're sitting? We'll love to get your thoughts. And as a follow-up question also, what are the bottlenecks you think which really need to be crossed in order to finally reach a conclusion, at least at the G20 level, before we, progress even further?
Okay, I don't have a crystal ball, and I'm not certain that I'd like to try to predict what will happen at the G20. Of course, the agreement we have so far is just the G7, led very much on this by the US. At the G20 in July, the finance ministers, there will be a number of other countries, specifically China and India. And I'm very interested to hear the other panel members as to what they anticipate India's reaction will be to this. But even if it clears the G20, the next step is going to be the inclusive framework of the OECD. That's 139 countries, and that's going to bring on board a number of developing countries, a number of smaller jurisdictions, a number of low tax jurisdictions. I'm not certain that they will have the power to stop something that may have become a little bit of a runaway train by then. But what may happen is that the proposal will change. And if one's talking about bottlenecks, I think there are a number of key elements. One of them is what carve-outs there will be from the minimum tax. We'll come back to talk about that later. Another key question is whether or not countries are going to have to get rid of their digital service taxes or their equalization levies. For example, the European Union is going to unveil in July proposals for a digital levy, and they're going to go ahead with that, and that will apply to all EU member countries. Well, if the US is insistent that digital taxes are dropped, then that could well be a real fly in the ointment. Finally, before I pass it on, we still have to see whether the Biden administration can get this past the US Congress, because everything in a sense is conditional upon the Americans buying in, particularly to Pillar 1. And there's a big question mark as to whether at the end of the day, this still can be delivered through Congress. But I'm very keen to hear what other panelists say, particularly about India's reaction.
So then let's straight away dive into India. Akhilesh, Ranjan sir, I think we have been, there's lots to talk about where India is concerned. India introduced Equalization Levy 2.0. There's an SCP. There have been plans to, or, there has been a commitment to roll back the unilateral DSTs once global consensus is achieved. So is this really the global consensus which India would have been hoping for? How do you really suppose this development is going to affect India? And also in between, we also saw, a little bit of favoritism towards Article 12B, the union, to the UN model, and which was also confirmed. all of these developments happening at the same time, the thresholds under SAP also recently being announced, the US pulling back on, levying tariffs on Indian products, and now this agreement. So too much happening, in a very short frame of time. What is your reaction from an Indian perspective, and how do you really see this going in India?
Well, there's a whole lot of questions, Parul, and quite difficult to answer at one go, but let me try. So India had always been keen to find a way of taxing these new business models in the digitalized economy. Right from the BEPS discussions, when it was still on, we had been saying that we need a separate treatment, a special treatment, a tax treatment, a change in tax treaties, a change in tax principles, which was to address this. Now, the discussions in the Pillar 1 have not really gone the way that India would have wanted them. If India's stand, and I'm sure you all are aware of it, we had always wanted to establish an alternate nexus first in the form of a significant economic presence, and then attribute income to that through a fractional apportionment. That's in a sense the Indian approach, which we think is a simple model. It's a more fair model. It's something which can eliminate double taxation to a large extent. Somehow the Pillar 1 has gone the reverse way. It has started by allocating profits, finding a way of allocating profits, and then trying to fix a nexus which can tax the profit which is allocated to each country and nothing more. So it's not on principle what India would have wanted. However, that doesn't take away from the fact that there is a definite movement from the old established principles of fixed place and permanent establishment. So there is reason to hope that things will then move forward. And and on the allocation of income, there are many aspects of this amount A which are being worked out on a formulary apportionment basis. That's again something which India welcomes. It's a movement in the right direction, maybe not up to India's expectation. I personally don't think that having come this far in the negotiations and discussions that India would turn around and be a deal breaker at this point of time. I think India would like to go along with the consensus and mold the discussions in a way that suits its interests more and bring it closer to what we had wanted in the first place, which is a more fair and equitable allocation of profits, as our finance minister has been saying quite often. And what is meant by fair and equitable is, of course, something which people interpret differently. And that's where the crux of this whole discussion would lie, as to what is fair and equitable. What we are heartened by the fact that it has been agreed that both pillars will be discussed together, the solution will be found together. That's something that India was very concerned with. We have never been too bothered about Pillar 2, although we went along with the discussion saying that India is ambivalent towards the concept of a minimum tax. We have in that, in fact, asked for a subject to tax rule, which comes into tax treaties. And that's something which I suppose India will still be trying to have it established. It's already sort of accepted as an agreed thing, but whether it's a minimum standard, how forcefully does it recommended, is something that has to be seen. Otherwise, the minimum tax or that doesn't really affect India to any great extent in the near future. So I think all in all, India welcomes the progress. We welcome the fact that a solution is now possible. There are many issues apart from these broad issues mentioned in the G7 communique. Some were mentioned by Dr. Baker just now. What is it? What are the profits to be allocated, first of all? What are those percentages, and how do you arrive at a 20% or a 10%? What is the sanctity of these numbers? Is there a basis? Is it arm's length? I don't think so. So where do these numbers come from, this 10% and 20%? So I think more work is required to come to a more reasoned solution. More work is required to see that countries can implement these proposals in a simple manner. There are already proposals from other groups of nations, like the ATAF, the African Tax Administrations Forum, from the G24. Those proposals are again on the lines of what India has been maintaining. So there are a number of countries who are, I think, willing to talk further or would like to talk further on these numbers and how the allocation is to be done. The UN proposal, Arul, I mean, well, the committee of experts or the UN is not a government body, as you're aware. So that's not, 12B is not an official Indian government stand. In fact, it has not been officially approved or endorsed anywhere by the government of India. Personally, I would say that it's attempting a bilateral solution to a multilateral problem, and therefore it's not really a very sophisticated answer to this problem. However, the importance of the UN 12B is that it brings into light the fact that there can be simple solutions. It's possible to think of simple solutions and not just get stuck in amount A or amount B and amount C as it earlier was, or in residual profit splits and what have you. It is possible to think in different ways that could be implemented easily by developing countries who don't have the necessary expertise. So and that it also sort of gave expression to the voice of a large number of developing countries. So that's something which is important. That's the important, significant part about the UN proposal or the article. But currently, I think once India is signing on to the Pillar 1, if it does sign on to the Pillar 1, and I'm sure it will, I suppose, then I don't think it can ask for negotiating its tax treaties to include Article 12B. They don't just go together. So it's something that we may have to really not consider for the time being. So I think that's what the position is. I think let's wait and what the government is going to do at the G20. As I said, I don't think it will be a deal breaker, but certainly India should be pushing hard to get some of the principles right in this system of allocation of income.
Dinesh bhai, pressing on from what Akhilesh sir said, and any comments you have on what the comments that Akhilesh sir made, but any winners or losers that you've picked out, Dinesh bhai, you're consultant to advisor to some of the top corporate groups, both Indian and MNCs. Any apparent winners and losers here?
So a couple of things just following up on what Mr. Akhilesh Ranjan stated. He raised a right issue as to how do you come to this 10% and 20%. But just to give you a pure mathematical impact of this whole thing, unless a company makes a profit of 35%, and again, I'm not into the complexities on how does one compute the profit, India will not get to 2% equalization level. Let me explain. If you make 35% profit going by the current proposal, then 25% is excess over 35. 20% of that is 5. And if you tax that at 40%, then you get 2%, which is what you are charging today by way of equalization levy. So in sheer arithmetic, what India is today doing unilaterally, and I'm not saying that you can continue, and I think Mr. Akhilesh is absolutely spot on, that you can't have parallel trains running in this case. So India may not want to be a deal breaker. But I would not be surprised if India is going to push very, very hard to say why this 10% and 20% does not make sense, because it is really inconsistent with what India believes it has a right to tax. So that's one part. Second, it's very easy to say that the G20 will meet and then the broader consensus will emerge and a solution will be found. But what do you mean by a solution being found? It's very easy for a broad framework to come back and say, or for the politicians to come back and say, oh, we have done and dusted. This is a problem which has been going on for the last so many years, and we have found an answer. But I think the key thing, again, which Mr. Akhilesh Ranjan mentioned, and I would like to delve a little bit deeper into it, is what are those profits which are subject to tax? We have issues regarding exemptions, and again, London, for example, is talking about not taxing financial services. China is talking about not levying the tax on R&D. What happens to let's take UAE as an example. And if UAE went into something like this, they have got SEZs with which 50-year contracts have been signed. Will that be sort of allowed to be grandfathered? So a number of issues coming. On your question about winners and losers, again, let me put 2 points out there. Very recently, you had a very practical example. We all know that IBM split into 2 companies, 2 separate companies altogether with 2 separate managements. Now, what do you mean when you say you are a top 100 company? If you have split your, so for example, if Amazon split itself into the cloud business and the e-commerce business, does it suddenly come out of this entire thing? Again, how do you deal with unlisted companies? What goes in, what goes out? The list will keep on changing. The top 100 companies today are not the top 100 companies tomorrow. So really, we are looking at a variety of things which is happening out here. And therefore, even assuming that we go by what Mr. Akhilesh Ranjan stated, that we get some consensus at G20 and at a broader thing, how will the implementation of that be is going to be the key thing. As it is, we'll come to later as to what are those profits, accounting, tax, a separate issue altogether. But even at a broader level, what companies will it impact? Will the same companies continue next year if they go out of 100? And again, why would any different principle apply to a company which is outside 100? Because if you accept the proposition which India has been advocating for such a long time, that market jurisdiction should be allowed to tax, then why should it not apply across? And why would you restrict it to just the top 100? And why will it not apply all the way across? So quite a few things. And rather than say, are there clear winners? I would say really that any company which is today dealing with India and is subject to an equalization levy, if the proposals are accepted as proposed and India is not able to push them back, then really all of them are winners.
Parul, your next one for Porus,
I think,
maybe?
Yeah. So, and Dinesh, I'm going to come back to your point on this 2% and in the context of 100, top 100 MNEs. But before we do that, let's move to Porus. And we've been talking about global consensus and how this is a landmark achievement. But do you really think, Porus, that this is really such a huge step towards global consensus? Is international tax really being overhauled? Is this really the year we've all been waiting for, since the BEPS project started? Or is it just, it's the same wine, but in an old bottle, or, the other way around, actually? So just your thoughts on that. You're on mute.
No, I think this is a huge overall, because this is creation of a new taxing right for those in the sense that the tax, as Akhilesh mentioned, the rules were really stuck in the 1960s, et cetera, with our concepts of P. We have not really expanded that. And today the business models have changed. Tax hasn't caught up. So if you're going to give a new right to tax to market countries, that is a completely different concept than what we have. The nexus rules will have to change, though they may not change to the extent that perhaps Akhilesh wanted. They will have to change to grant that right. It is going to be huge. Of course, my concern is the amount of emphasis that we are putting on corporate taxation, the amount of discussions that are putting on corporate taxation. Corporate taxation is still not a significant revenue earner or a driver for many countries yet, whether it's indirect taxes or other taxes that are the main drivers. But the entire discussion is on corporate taxes. And I think we are looking at, again, a limited amount of companies that attract the global's attention. Between my panelists, I had a joke this morning, and it was a twist on what Churchill said in the 1940s. In 1940s, Churchill said, there is a lot which is owed by many to so few. I think this way, or today, when we look at the global tax, we are looking at a reverse situation where all the governments, all the entire public is looking and saying, how few owe so many. And this discussion is being fueled by these discussions on pillar 1 and 2. Again, nothing wrong, as I do agree with what Akhilesh said, and to a certain extent, the position of the developing world and the market countries, the rules have to change because the business models have changed. How much revenue will be gained? I do not know. Again, if you will see, what has been put on the table is a profit of 10% first, and then up to 20% of the profit in excess of 10% is to be shared. Now, does this mean only to be shared globally, to be shared in the market country, etc.? It's not clear. And I would agree with what Dinesh says. The revenue may not be as significant under this model as perhaps the developing world want it to be.
Thanks, Porus. That's quite enlightening. We'll move to the pillar one side of the proposal, and of course, we all know that the complexity which was associated with pillar one proposals has been one of the key technical issues. The US proposal supported a simplification through a neutral scope by removing all the complications with respect to ADS or consumer-facing businesses. And while the G7 agreement does not specifically refer to ADS or CFB businesses, but it does provide for allocation of taxing rights to market jurisdictions for the largest and most profitable MNEs. So, Philip, this question is for you. Do you think this agreement for taxing in excess of the 10% profitability threshold and including just the largest and most profitable MNEs without specifically referring to the US proposal is really negotiating off the US proposal, and that's something that will bring us closer to to the agreement that we are all hoping for? And secondly, given all the news report with respect to opposition from Republicans in the US, how do you really foresee this planning out where US is concerned? Is that really a bottleneck that we're talking about? And I think, just as an add-on question, Dinesh also spoke about, how in the UAE it may be different, and UAE doesn't have any taxes. And I read your most helpful article on Taxsutra's tax ring, where you talked about how is this really something which is just a reinvention of the CFC proposal. So maybe some light on your thoughts, with respect to that as well.
Okay, well, there's quite a lot to answer there. So let me perhaps limit it to the first main point. I'll come back a little later about the CFC proposal, which is part of Pillar 2. I suspect that the final agreement that will be reached will be based upon the US proposal, which moves away from targeting either only the digital businesses or only consumer-facing businesses or a combination of the two, and instead identifies the largest multinationals. I believe that if you look at the figures, even though the earlier OECD proposals were probably going to target about 2,300 countries, and the US proposals are the 100 largest. Actually, the amount of profit made by those 100 largest companies is not that much less than if you take the whole 2,300. So if you're looking at achieving a result, you can achieve the result largely with the same 100. And that avoids this difficulty of saying, are we going to target just the digital businesses, which the US would never accept, or are we going to have to otherwise define the target? It's not a terribly intellectually attractive solution to say, well, we're just going to identify 100 targets and apply this to them. One would like to think that there ought to be some principle behind it. And there is a question as to whether this is just the starting point, and whether if this new taxing right is adopted, whether in time it will be extended to other countries. But as a starting point, I suspect that the US proposals will lead ahead on this, though there's a lot more detail. In terms of how this will be treated by US businesses, I am certain that this comes to the sticking point, the question of whether this can get through US Congress. And don't forget that though the Democrat administration has a majority, it's a very, very thin majority, and certainly in the Senate. Businesses in the US if they feel that they are seriously disadvantaged, may well be lobbying very hard. I haven't been following this personally, but my understanding is that the companies that are within scope, there hasn't really been a negative impact on their market pricing. And that suggests one of two things. Either that the market doesn't believe that this will ever actually be achieved, that it won't be possible to get it through the US Congress, or that it is so small in terms of the added tax paid by these companies that it doesn't really affect their market valuation. I wouldn't want to really comment on that, but it's going to be one of the factors is going to be how US business reacts and how they carry out their lobbying in US Congress.
Thanks, Philip. Akhilesh, Ranjan sir, I think, I've been wanting to ask you this question ever since Dinesh, he described his 2% calculation. So very simple question for you. You said that, you talked about how this proposal may ultimately be, good for India, and this is what we've been waiting for. Going by Dinesh's calculation of how this could actually result in a 2% tax, which is equivalent to the equalization levy, which India is currently levying. And of course, the ambit is also all encompassing, but it does limit, the tax to 100 MNEs. And to that extent, do you think in this whole agreement, India will end up being a net beneficiary?
Well, if Dinesh says it won't be, so I must believe what he says. I think I agree. In fact, I think even if you take these top 100 companies, and Dr. Baker very rightly pointed out that the combined profits of these 100 top companies would be probably of the same level as you take 2,000 companies, and not much of a difference significantly. But then. Yes, it does appear that if this same formula is carried on and accepted, then perhaps the amount of revenue that comes to India may not be the same as what we can potentially collect under the equalization levy. But then, at the same time, I think India has made it very clear politically that if there is a consensus solution to which it is a party, then the equalization levy will be withdrawn. But that would refer to, firstly, a fair and equitable solution, and secondly, the equalization levy as it stands now, in the shape it is. How then do we try and make up for revenues? What happens later on is something which will have to be examined and thought about. It's interesting to note the European Union's proposal for a digital levy. I'm still unable to understand the full implications, but they maintain that it will be a levy which will be in addition to the Pillar 1 solution. It will not be in conflict with that, and yet it will be a digital levy. So, I mean, there could be, I'm sure, ways of trying to make up the shortfall. But on principle, it will be something which will be of some satisfaction if we can get some principles established in this consensus solution, that there is a need to allocate income to market jurisdictions, that there is a need to define an alternate nexus. And I think those are the main gains that India would be looking at in this sort of a solution.
Yeah, Dinesh bhai, you think there is a possibility, Akhilesh just mentioned, I think the caveat here is a fair and equitable solution. These are words that are difficult to define, like in accounting, true and fair. So, Dinesh, anything you think that could be deal breakers? Do you really anticipate, I mean, looking at the political muscle that the G20 or G7 has thrown behind this, Dinesh bhai and Philip both, first Dinesh bhai, you think there could be deal breakers in this? And what do you think would be the deal breakers?
I think you're absolutely right, Arun, that with all the political muscle and everybody wanting to say the right things, you're going to get a consensus at a headline level. So at a headline level, we'll meet whatever we need to. But tax is all about, as I mentioned earlier on, devil being in the details. And I think that's where so for example, just to take your point further, when we are referring to profits, there is question about what are those profits we are looking at. Are we looking at accounting profits? Are we looking at tax profits? And if you are looking at accounting profits, the accounting standards in each country are different. Is every country willing to accept profits calculated on the basis of accounting standards of the other country? If you're looking at tax profits, USA, for example, currently has an accelerated depreciation on all capital expenditure that you do. Belgium, for example, gives you an allowance for a percentage on equity contributed. Will India or will every country accept that proposition? So it's really not about whether there will be deal breakers. I don't think there are going to be deal breakers. I think where I see challenges is in the carve out. So just as you had OECD commentary, and then after everything, countries had their reservations. I'm worried that would it be here also that you will reach a broad consensus, and then every country will come out with its own set of questions on reservations, and what will those reservations lead to? I think that's really the crux of the issue.
Philip, you want to take a quick jab at that?
Very briefly, there is a huge pressure amongst politicians to get an agreement, and no country will want to be the country that stops an agreement. The OECD in particular are desperate for an agreement. If they can't get an agreement on this, then what's the point of having the OECD at all? So I think what will happen is a tremendous number of concessions that are being made. And I agree with Dinesh around issues like the carve out, the definition of the taxable basis, whether certain types of equalization levies will be permitted. One by one, any possible block to the deal will be circumnavigated by making little concessions to this country and another. I'm certain that India, for example, will go into the G20 finance ministers meeting with the knowledge that they have power, that even without wanting to stop the deal, India can still demand a price for its consent. And that's going to also be the case of some of the groups within the inclusive framework, that they will demand concessions for their consent. So what we end up with at the end of the day may be quite different from what the G7 agreed a week and a half ago.
You know, the poster behind me is that of Parul guessed it right. That is Saving Private Ryan, one of the greatest movies ever made. You know, the tagline of the movie was, "The mission is a man. The mission is a tax deal." Parul.
Yeah. So we're talking about, what are the, do you really think this will happen? What are the bottlenecks? But Porus, my question to you is slightly different. Assuming we are reaching, a consensus, everything is going according to plan. How do you really see this interplaying? How do you see this being implemented? Are we talking about bilateral treaties plus an MLI? How is this really going to happen? How many tax treaties are we really talking about here?
Well, I think the only way I can answer is that there's a very nice Christmas song called the 12 Days of Christmas. You begin with a partridge in a pear tree, you go to 2 turtle doves, you go through 3 French hens, and you keep adding on like that till you reach something that you like. We have now 2 treaties already sitting on top of each other. For example, you first start with domestic law. You have the bilateral treaty sitting on top of domestic law. Perhaps that may not be a correct way of interpretation. It sits alongside domestic law. However, you now come to the MLI. The MLI does sit on top of the bilateral treaty. When you have now what could be possibly, and the only way to implement this is by another MLI or by 2 MLIs, one on pillar 1, one on pillar 2. And the question will be now, these 2 MLIs will have to sit on top of the existing MLI, existing bilateral treaty, and carve out a separate right to tax. It will have to be also married into the existing treaties for the purposes of credit of that tax at the very least. And of course, it will then have its own dispute resolution procedures. So it's going to be something extremely complicated. For our friends who are sitting in Bombay, you are familiar with the Janmashtami festival, which is like a pyramid of persons. You know what happens to the person at the bottom of that pyramid. There's not much left of him. So I don't know what will be left of our bilateral treaties at the end of the two MLI sitting on top of the existing MLI. Having said this, I think again, I come back, yes, this is a necessary provision that has to be done. How we can do it, how we can simplify it is going to be critical. One of the most important thing is, I think, going to be dispute resolution. When you have a global system of profits, a global system of allocation of profits, and the right to tax to multifarious countries, you must have a dispute resolution mechanism for the corporates that is efficient and fast. We cannot await for the domestic tax areas to sort out that litigation. It has to be, for example, if I'm a company sitting in any country and have 3 countries deciding how much of my profits they can tax, or how much is my profits allowed to be taxed under this new model, I should be probably allowed to go for a multilateral competent authority procedure so that I can settle it way before probably the tax year is out, so I can compute it and put it in my financials. So I think this is going to be critical. On the method of accounting, certainly there are going to be huge issues how to determine profits. There is perhaps one thing that we existingly have. If you will see all bilateral DTAs, you have a provision in the computation of business profits, which provides that profits for the purposes of the P will be allowed as a deduction. Now, if you use that similar wording, perhaps you will get over what Dinesh mentioned is the accelerated depreciation in the United States, or the deduction on share capital in Belgium, because these are not for the purposes. So you have an existing wording that you can use. Alternatively, you will have to go for IFRS or some global standard to determine profits. I'll come to the breakdown of my profits in the second segment. But again, as I said, the challenge will be, how do you work the interplay between the new MLI, the old MLI, and the treaties for the purposes of computation, chargeability, dispute resolution, and credit of taxes?
If I could come in, Parul, for a moment, as Porus rightly points out, we need another MLI. But just go back to the existing MLI on what BEPS has already decided. On an average, it has taken 2 years to get a ratification done. Greece took 4 years to ratify. Spain is still not on board. And mind you, in all of this, USA was not even a party. And so totally, as I agree with Porus, that this might require 1 or maybe 2 MLIs, one on pillar 1 and one on pillar 2. How long will it take for all the countries to get into that MLI is again a thing which we all need to factor. And therefore, between the proposal now coming into force or being accepted and it actually being implemented, what is going to be the time lag is something which I shudder to think about.
Good. I can definitely see that, if not anyone, but tax advisors are going to have quite a bit of a ball in the coming years. So let's just talk a little bit about Pillar 2. Pillar 2 has, the consensus seems to be, the G7 consensus seems to be for the 15% global minimum tax. And of course, the US seems to have pushed itself in coming down from 21% to 15%. Dinesh, question for you. Do you really see any concern from an Indian perspective? Of course, India is a developing country. Our taxes are much higher than that. Even our MAT rate is 15% plus surcharge. But do you think there's any concern that India can have on the global minimum tax? Any issues that you could identify?
I think 2 parts to it. First is that there has to be a global consensus on existing agreements that companies may have had. So, for example, we have special economic zone. And again, remember, MAT is a tax on book profit. We could be actually not reducing that. We have the gift city, where the rate of tax is much lower. I think India ought not to be worried about that 15% tax, because there will be exemptions. It is not that India is trying to be a tax haven. It is only that there are certain areas which have been given a concession, and if those concessions have been given prior to the G7 or G20 or a global consensus emerging, then I don't see those as being challenged. Or on a lighter note, if my earlier thought process, Parul, is right, there's going to take some years by which the consensus will emerge. Most of these concessions would have been out by that point of time. I think the more important thing, as I mentioned earlier on, is that there are several countries which have got specific exemptions. For example, you may have exemption for startups, you may have other exemptions. There will have to be a policy decision taken as to how do you deal with the concessions which already exist compared to concessions which may be given after the 15% comes up. And that's an area on which a lot of work may need to be done.
Akhilesh, sir, you think we will need any tweaks to the domestic legislation? I'm sorry that I'm introducing even more complexity than what Porus has indicated. MLI on top of an MLI on top of bilateral treaties and all. But will there also be, will this necessitate, say, for example, any change in the income tax code that India has?
No, of course. I think the Pillar 2 proposal does involve changes in domestic legislation as well as in treaties. Even if India is not so keen about the income inclusion rule or the undertaxed payment rule, I think in order to be a party to the consensus, maybe those provisions in the law will have to be brought in, even if they are not really effective for some time. The income inclusion rule, as you're aware, it would apply essentially to Indian headquartered corporates who if they are using tax havens or low tax jurisdictions to divert profits, can be used against them, which we don't think really is the case at the moment. So it may not be very effective, but I think the changes will be there in the domestic law. And if we are party to a consensus, then I think India will go along with any MLI or two MLIs and be part of that agreement also.
Again, if I could just supplement what Mr. Akhilesh Ranjan said, the one set of things which could be impacted by this entire proposal is India outbound. So if you are using outbound, just not a huge portion of our tax revenues, but Indian companies going global and using tax treaties or low-cost jurisdictions to really ensure that they are able to park profits and get them into India could be one area where there could be a marginal change that could necessitate domestic changes, but that's not a big thing for India really.
Philip, maybe this is a very simple one, but for the uninitiated Philip, if this pertains to only the top 500 companies in the world, the Fortune 500, let's say, then why should the world worry at all? They have the best tax advisors, the best professionals, the best legal advisors. You are there if there is any problem. So then why should if they have to litigate and spend a few $1 million in litigation fees every year across the world? So what's the harm? I'm just asking. I mean, if it's going to affect only the top 500 companies.
Well, I'm not certain that Pillar 2 necessarily is going to affect only the top 500 companies. Pillar 1, the discussion is to limit it to the only 100 countries. But Pillar 2 is really, in a sense, aimed at jurisdictions that are low tax jurisdictions and trying to encourage them to move up to the 15% minimum tax, and then to counter that by the inadequately taxed rules that combine together. So it's going to have a broader impact than just that. I mean, if I can perhaps pick up from what Dinesh was saying about carve-outs, to my mind, in Pillar 2, the absolutely critical point is going to be what carve-outs are agreed. In other words, what sectors are not covered by Pillar 2. It's already been mentioned the possibility that the financial sector may not be included. I think that the UK is talking about that not being included in Pillar 1, but it seems logical that they would also want to have it taken out of Pillar 2. The extractive industry sector is likely to be excluded. Companies involved in research and development, there's already been a lot of work on patent boxes with lower tax rates. Special economic zones, I'm certain that China will want to have a carve out. And this goes back to this process of bringing countries on board. Country after country is going to want to have its particular industries protected. We may end up with a Pillar 2, which has more holes in it than a Swiss cheese, because to get agreement, this country wants this industry excluded and another country wants another industry excluded. And that takes me to my last comment, which is how this may be implemented. I agree with the comments made earlier that I think in order to implement Pillar 1, there will have to be a multilateral treaty, because that impacts on taxing rights and it does interrelate to existing bilateral treaties. Pillar 2 is essentially a requirement largely of changing domestic tax law. And so for that, I could imagine an agreement at a level of principle implemented, and this may be very important, by a peer review process. In other words, checking that countries are not cheating on this. The countries haven't said, we agree to the minimum tax, but then we're going to carve out this and that and the other. And I think there's going to have to be an ongoing process of peer review of there. The OECD has been quite adept over the last 10 years or so at implementing tax changes through peer reviews as a way of ensuring that countries live up to their commitments. And that's also going to be a critical point of any ongoing agreement, particularly on the Pillar 2 side.
Parul, we have around 5 to 7 minutes, after which we'll take a few questions among the many that have come. So Parul, now we'll have to play 2020. Or if I can use an analogy here, I have a chessboard. Parul, which move would you play on the chessboard? Which is your favorite piece? Can you tell me?
Pawn to Queen 2.
That's my favorite. Parul, yours?
Good opening gambit.
Mine too.
Mine too. Great. So we don't know who's the pawn here. India will be opening. India is the pawn. That will become the queen. Parul, we have 5 to 7 minutes.
Yeah. So I think just one last question to Porus, and maybe all our panelists can give their last comments on how they really see this unfolding now. But Porus, I think when we were talking about this G7 communication few days ago, you spoke about how transfer pricing rules may also get impacted. So any thoughts on, how do we really see the face of transfer pricing changing and interaction with the Pillar 1 proposals?
Yes, so I think the last I remember we had reached 3 French hens in my Christmas song. So we'd have to go to 4 calling birds. So now you would have to have transfer pricing rules, which will have to be married in both to the original treaty, the bilateral treaty, and certainly into Pillar 1 to determine profits. You must remember in Pillar 2, as Philip mentioned, it could be a domestic amendment. But again, in Pillar 2, if it is an MLI, you would probably need to work out the global taxes on the basis of a unified proposal. And you may net out interstate transactions between companies or corporates to determine. But when you return to Pillar 1, which is the right to tax in the country of source or the country of market, whichever you call it, those will be primarily transactions between A's or associated enterprises. Therefore, you would have to transfer price them also. And all of us are aware globally that transfer pricing disputes are a generation by themselves. They occupy probably now a significant amount of corporate, of competent authority procedure and disputes and reconciliation. So I think when you have now that as an added dimension, it certainly will be a minefield that we'd have to implement. But again, as I said, I don't think you have an option. You must remember that as far as pillar 1 goes, it's a new taxing, right? Pillar 2 goes, the way I look at it, it's BEPS against countries. We had BEPS against corporates in the 15 action plans. Pillar 2 is BEPS against countries who do that. You don't have an option. I think the answer is probably to try the best to simplify it and to have an effective dispute resolution mechanism. Otherwise, you are going to have a completely fractured global tax community. You are going to have many unilateral measures outside DTAs like equalization levies, or worst of all, I think just 4 days ago, Russia terminated its treaty with Netherlands. And if we see that happening now, 2 years down the line or 3 years down the line, when say market countries do not get their due, I think we're going to enter back into the world of complete double taxation.
Porus is leaving us with some ominous thoughts. Last comments from Akhilesh, Dinesh, Bhai, and Philip. Akhilesh, 30 seconds.
No, so I think, as I said, there's a long way ahead. It's significant for these countries to agree to a broad solution, but even that broad solution is to be tested first in the G20, and that's going to be a major test, as other panelists have also pointed out. A thing that we have not been talking about right now, the elephant in the room, what is China going to say? And it has made some statements which can be interpreted in different ways. But China also has some concerns on these issues, particularly on Pillar 2. And Pillar 2 is the main focus of all these discussions. So, and so that's why the G20 itself is going to be something very, very interesting. And then that's not the end of it. And thereafter, as I said, there are now countries beyond the G20 who do have a voice. The G24, the ATAF, the CIAT, the Latin American countries, they all are vocal. They all have been speaking and coming out now, and they all have very clear views. So all this demand about extractive industries being taken out of the purview, this is essentially to appease the African states. And similarly, I mean, the African states are not going to just stop at that. So I think there's a whole lot of discussion which is bound to happen. Some very tough negotiations in the inclusive framework, which is 139 countries. It's no longer the old times where 10 countries still decided everything and the rest of the 100 countries fell in line. That probably is not the scenario now in these multilateral discussions. So it's going to be very interesting times. But I still think that there is a political will to have a solution, and therefore a solution we will have. How effective and how fair and equitable the solution is something to be seen.
So one word answer. By when do you see this deal, if it goes through, implemented in India? When will it be implemented?
Oh, it will certainly take a couple of years, because I mean, you have to have changes in the treaty. You have to have an MLI drafted first of all, then signed, ratified. You have to have changes in domestic law. It's something which is at least taking 2 years down the line. But then and that's why I say, don't say goodbye to equalization levy so soon. It's going to be there for the next 2 years at least.
Great. That's the headline. That's the headline. Dinesh bhai?
A few points. Mr. Akhilesh Ranjan spoke about extractive industry. There is similar issue on shipping profits. There's similar issue on airline profits. So there are quite a few industries which are required to be dealt with. I think Porus was absolutely right when he spoke about how will interpretation happen after all the MLIs and everything is done. And therefore, from my perspective, Arun, I will go back to where I began. And I said that, look, these are great times for people practicing international tax. I think it's going to take a few years. I think if I may dare say, Mr. Akhilesh Ranjan is being too optimist when he believes that this can happen in 2 years. I think it's going to take far more than that. In the meantime, A, unilateral measures are going to be there, and B, countries are also going to implement some of the portions which are agreed to and not yet implemented, to say in principle whatever we are saying has been accepted and therefore we are going to implement those. So a number of those things are going to happen. good times for those practicing international taxes.
Dinesh, by one line again, a very simple, fundamental, basic question: will all of this change the way we read or we used to read the double tax avoidance treaties? Will it completely change the way we read them?
It certainly will change, without doubt, Arun. We are sort of quietly trying to bury, and not maybe bury is a very strong word, but a very close relook at permanent establishment. We are recognizing what the new digital economy has done to permanent establishment, etc. We are accepting the concept of market jurisdiction. So it does mean a lot of change. But does it do away with the complexity? Will we be able to come with a global framework where multinational, today what is the dilemma? Dilemma is, on the one hand, multinationals, if they are not paying taxes, each country wants its fair share of taxes. From a multinational corporation's perspective, they don't want litigation and they want certainty. I don't think those are going to be achieved in the near term. In the long term, hopefully things will settle down and some better consensus will emerge.
Yeah, final word to Philip, of course, before I shoot some tough questions. Philip, your final word. You always had a contrarian take ever since you gave the keynote address at the first Taxsutra conclave 6 years ago in 2015 October. Philip, 6 years down the line, your contrarian take on the entire. Let's expand this a bit, Philip. Can you end by saying whether you still stick by your original pessimism on the BEPS project and what it's been able to achieve, if at all, in the last 6 years, Philip?
Oh, I still stick to my pessimism or my view that
criticism.
The original BEPS 1.0 project didn't really tackle the right issues. I mean, in a sense, this is Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 are BEPS 2.0, and they wouldn't have been necessary if BEPS 1.0 had tackled the right issues and had come to the solutions on, for example, Action Point 1. We've needed this second process because BEPS 1.0 didn't solve the problem. Have we solved the problems with BEPS 2.0? I think if I can sort of sum up, I get the impression that there is consensus amongst us that there will be an agreement. Exactly the terms of that agreement are still very much out for negotiation. And as it goes through the various processes this year, we will see changes in terms of the detail and the implementation, and ultimately whether or not the US government can deliver on this, and issues like what the European Commission does with its digital levy and what other countries do about dropping withholding taxes on digital service fees. So there's a lot still to be worked out there. But I think there's such a pressure. The international politicians want to get this issue off their agenda. They want to be able to say, tick the box, we've dealt with that. We've dealt with the results of the 2008 financial crisis. Right, tick, we've done that. We now have to deal with COVID. New problem, we're going to deal with that. Climate change, they want to get onto that. They don't want to be stuck with this. So there's a strong pressure for getting an agreement, but what exactly the details are going to be. My final comment actually is I'm looking here very puzzled about Porus's comment about the Christmas Carol and a partridge in a pear tree. And the reason I'm puzzled is because in our garden during lockdown, we've had 2 partridges that are running around the garden, and they are completely inseparable. I have never seen just one partridge in a pear tree or anywhere else. They must be a married couple, these partridges, because the larger one, who I guess is the male, whenever he walks in a direction, the little one, I think is the wife, runs after him and never lets him more than about 6 feet away from him, out of her sight. So I'm puzzling about this idea that we start with the partridge in a pear tree, because I can't imagine a single partridge, or for that matter, I suppose a monolateral tax treaty can't exist.
That was wonderful. We'll see who's the husband, who's the wife at the G20 next month, Parul and Philip. We have some questions, Parul. Maybe we can take a call if we want to take which ones to take. I'll just read out the first two or three. First one, I think we covered. Can Article 12B be the solution for treaties that are not CTA for India under MLI? Parul, this has been covered, I believe, right?
Yes, Akhilesh, Ranjan sir covered that briefly.
Yeah, and I'll take the next one. The next one is, I think we've covered most of the questions. I'm just saying, GMT introduction may push UAE to introduce corporate income taxes. What are your thoughts, Dinesh bhai? You travel to UAE often.
No, so I think there has been a speculation for a long time as to whether UAE is going to introduce corporate tax or not. A couple of things. UAE has just introduced VAT. It's about 3 years old. It has been a huge success for them, both in terms of revenue collection and monitoring of the economy. And I do think it's a matter of time before they introduce corporate tax. Again, remember, all the G20 proposals are aimed to tax corporates and not non-corporates, whereas there are quite a few LLP formats, etc., which prevail in UAE. That's number one. And number two, there's a very peculiar way in which Saudi Arabia, for example, taxes the corporates. The share of profit which accrues to a non-resident is subjected to income tax. The locals pay a zakat tax. So it'll be interesting to see how corporate tax, when introduced in UAE, will be there. And finally, there are so many SEZs out there. In fact, lot of businesses preponderantly within those special economic zones. And in those special economic zones, there are 10, 20, 50-year agreements for exemption. How do we deal with that? That's going to be interesting to see.
Yeah, the other questions I figured out, Parul, almost all of them have been taken care of by the panelists, and I think Parul had already anticipated what are the questions that are going to come from the audience. So everything is covered almost, from the audience.
Arun, in a question to me in the chat, one of the participants asked perhaps a question that's slightly away from pillar 1 and 2, and that is, does the US intend to do away with the check the box regulations? And just to say two things about that. Firstly, I don't get any impression that the Biden administration is planning to get rid of the check the box regulations. But of course, and this comes back to the question that Parul asked earlier, if one sees elements of the Globe Pillar 2 minimum tax proposals as a broadening of the CFC legislation, check the box has driven a coach and horses through the operation of the US CFC legislation. And so there's a very important question as to how if the US retains check the box, how effective the minimum tax proposals are going to be with regard to international groups that are headquartered in the US. Because if they can still check the box as a way of, for example, it is supposed that the minimum tax will operate on a country by country basis. But if you check the box to disregard an entity, you effectively disregard a jurisdiction. And so you can mix high tax and low tax income through that. So that's going to be one of the interesting complexities as to how, if the US is on board, this is going to work with the check the box approach. I would have to say that one of the biggest failures of BEPS 1 was that the US was not brought on board and was not persuaded to get rid of the check the box regulations, which I think was definitely one of the targets of BEPS 1.0 and was unsuccessful.
Yeah, Philip, suddenly a lot of questions have poured in, Parul, but I'll take only one. Is that fair? Is it in, and Parul, maybe you want to take this, is it in some form a return of EU's CCTB TB, that is, I think, the common corporate tax base, right? I think so, or maybe the next pillar of BEPS. That's what the question is.
Did you want me to answer that?
You can, Philip.
Just to say that the European Commission released a communication on corporate tax about 3 weeks ago. And in that, they have proposed that they will withdraw the old CCCTB proposals, but they are going to come forward later this year with a new proposal designed around a minimum tax, and which will also include a common corporate tax base, as I think a number of the speakers have indicated, particularly Akhilesh and Dinesh. In order to operate a minimum tax, key issues are, what are you going to tax? And the European Union is proposing to tackle that through their sort of what should we call it? CCCTB Mark II proposals.
Yeah. Parul, can we close this with one final question? I can put this to Porus as well. It's fun quiz for us in the beginning. Philip could not answer the first question. Let's see if he can answer the last one. Philip, I'm going back to Euro 96. That was the first time the concept of golden goal was introduced. Can you tell us when was the first golden goal scored in that entire tournament? Who scored it?
Is this to Porus or to me?
It's to you, Philip.
Can I ring my son and
No,
find
you
out?
can't. Quick.
Go first, golden goal there. I'm too young to remember this.
I do. I hope I'm not wrong. It was Germany in the final. Germany in the final.
Which year's final?
Euro 96.
I see. And who scored the goal?
Yeah, I don't remember that. I must tell you.
Oh, well, if you like to, you can ring my son. And
I remember Matthias was the German captain. But we'll end with Philip. Porus, you want to take a football question?
I think we've been kicking around enough things in this last one.
Okay. I don't want.
We can get back to cricket.
No. We will close with one question. Philip cannot get it wrong. The only time England won the silverware in football was in 1966. Tell us who scored the hat-trick for England that day, including a goal that wasn't.
Wasn't it Jeff Hurst who scored
that
the goal?
That was Jeff Hurst. Philip, I'm sending you a gift.
I have to tell you, my father was watching that, my late father, and when England scored that goal, he shouted, "Goal!" so loud that I think half of London heard it there. And I think that it's still echoing around our old house, that goal.
Philip, we are cheering here for England. If they do make it to Wembley, please get us a ticket. We'll be there.
You're very welcome on your way to Wembley. Wembley is only about 2 miles from where I am at the moment. So drop in for a cup of tea on your way.
Sure. That's so nice of you, Philip. Dinesh bhai, Philip, Akhilesh, Porus, so wonderful hearing from you all for the last 75 minutes. A riveting panel discussion on the G7 tax deal. I think the panelists have nailed it, that we are on the cusp of a big agreement, a big deal. But of course, you're going to have a lot of surprises on the way. Carve-outs just being one of them. Parul, last word to you.
Yeah. No, thanks a lot, everyone. And I think we are all eagerly waiting for a consensus to be achieved. We've been waiting for the last decade. And but I hear that, from Akhilesh, Ranjan sir, that we still have to live with equalization levy for a few years. And I hear from, from Porus that life is going to get very interesting for us tax professionals. And there is no chance to move to Dubai also with the corporate taxes coming in as per Dinesh. So I think I will take on Philip's offer and visit UK and have a cup of tea with him sometime soon.
On that note, we thank all the readers, the listeners, for a very, very patient audience. This has been one of the, of course, the highest attended webinars. Thanks so much for being a great audience. And we'll be back. Digital tax, if you want digital tax to be analyzed, please visit taxsutra.com. You'll hear you'll see the comments from all the panelists, from the who's who of the tax world, on taxsutra.com. Visit that and you'll see the best analysis on the G7 tax deal, on the G20 meeting. The moment the meeting gets over, you'll hear the experts' views right there on taxsutra.com. Thanks once again, everyone from across the globe who's joined us, not just India. Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Arun and Taxsutra. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.